All right, welcome to the latest Duke Media Briefing. I'm Amanda Soliday with Duke University Communications. Today, the FDA granted full approval of the Pfizer COVID vaccine. With us to discuss the approval is Dr. Mark McClellan. He's a physician and an economist who directs the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. He's also the former head of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We'll also be sending out a recording to participants afterwards. Thank you, Dr. McClellan.
Good to be on with you all.
All right, we'll get started. Our first question, Dr. McClellan, do you think full approval of the Pfizer vaccine will motivate those who are currently unvaccinated against COVID-19 to receive the shot?
I do think it'll make a difference, maybe not a large number of people running out and getting a vaccine today, but at this point, we've got a little bit over 70% of Americans who are eligible for the vaccine who have gotten at least one dose. That's about 87 million Americans who are eligible and haven't. And out of those, according to some recent surveys, about 30% say that the full approval of the Pfizer vaccine would make a difference in their decisions. So for anybody who does have doubts, this should help overcome it. We aren't really seeing anything fundamentally new in the announcement today about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. We know that it's very effective. We know that there are rare temporary side effects, but that the benefits really do seem to clearly outweigh the risks. Now we've got a lot more comprehensive review of that data over a longer time period. So that's all come together in one place, and that may make a difference for some of these individuals who have been hesitant. I do think that we now have very clear evidence that some of the, misinformation out there, like the vaccine can cause fertility issues or can cause COVID or things like that. It's just not there in the data. And on the other hand, the effectiveness really is in large scale, long-term trials now, and in the experience of millions and millions of additional Americans and people around the world who have had the vaccines. The other place that it will make a difference is in the actions of a number of businesses, schools and universities, maybe entertainment venues, state and local governments that will probably take this event to move forward with requiring vaccines in settings where people have to be together and there is a high risk of transmission with the Delta variant as widespread as it is. So you've already seen announcements today from places like the city of New York, the Pentagon for the U.S. military, additional schools likely to take similar steps in the coming days. So those things are going to bump up our vaccination numbers.
Excellent, thank you. Now we'll go ahead and take questions. We already have a few hands raised, which is wonderful. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. If you haven't already, you can post questions via the Q&A window at any time. And if you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Also, thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Okay, Dr. McClellan, we received this question from a few reporters. What do you see are the benefits of full approval compared to the emergency use authorization? For example, will the vaccine be available in new settings? Do you think the ability to market the vaccine will help vaccination rates?
I think the most important thing is the fact that full approval can reassure everyone that even though we're in the midst of a pandemic and it seems like some things are happening quickly, the FDA is applying all of its gold standard regulatory approaches, review authorities, close audits, everything that it does in normal circumstances when we're not in a pandemic. So that means, as I said before, not only requiring very large randomized blinded clinical trials, in this case, over 40,000 people who volunteered to participate, and now in many cases been followed for well over 6 months, not only reviewing lots of data on adverse events, on the experiences of millions of people around the world who have had the vaccine, also including review of manufacturing sites and the sites where the clinical trials were conducted, just to make sure that all the data that was coming in to the FDA was in fact accurate. So lots of audits. And the agency also goes through person by person, every patient who has data reported and verifies it. Doesn't just look at the aggregate numbers, but goes back to the hundreds of thousands of pages and files of the raw data. So that's all for usual circumstances. So it includes questions like, well, how stable does the vaccine remain in a ultra cold freezer for months? Not normally a question that you need to know the answer to if you're trying to get the vaccines into use quickly to have an impact on the pandemic, but a lot of evidence that's up to the FDA's gold standard. Now, they did this review faster than usual. It's only about 3 months. That's only about 40% of the time that it usually takes. I think if you go through all of the information that was posted summarizing what FDA did, you'll see that there were no corners cut. They were very diligent in all of this. So I think that's the most important benefit. Aside from that, now that the vaccine is fully approved, in principle, it could be used by doctors as they think is appropriate for their patients, so-called off-label prescribing. In practice, that's a little bit complicated because we are in the midst of a pandemic. And so all of the purchases for the vaccines now essentially have gone through big government contracts that are subject to terms set out by the Centers for Disease Control on how the vaccines are supposed to be used. So there may be some additional prescribing that goes on. But I think for the most part, the most important benefit is that confidence that FDA has applied its usual non-emergency gold standard review process to this vaccine.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Robin Kennedy. When will Moderna and J&J get full FDA approval? Could you talk a little bit about the difference in timelines for the 3 vaccines that are used in the United States?
Yeah, so great questions. And remember, those vaccines came along later. Moderna, a few weeks or so behind Pfizer, and Moderna announced early this summer that it was starting a process of submitting all of the data needed for full approval. And that's been ongoing since June. I don't think the Moderna approval is imminent, like within the next week or two, but should be happening within the coming weeks. And I'd look for some more announcements, just like you saw come out of FDA recently about the impending announcement of the Pfizer vaccine's full approval. Expect to see that in the coming weeks. J&J is a little bit behind that. And as you all know, I'm on the board for J&J, but the company is collecting all of that additional longer term follow-up data. It wasn't the trials were started a little bit later. The approval happened a few months later. So that's still coming together. And I'd expect that application to go into the FDA at some point this fall within the next few months. And then full approval, maybe a few months after that. So it's running a few months behind the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines.
Thank you. We have a question from Eric Berman. So he asks, some, including President Biden, have urged the FDA to take this step even sooner for full approval. Do you think it could have been taken earlier?
Well, I think if you heard from the agency leadership today, they had a press briefing where they announced the full approval and what had gone into it. They really emphasized just how much time and work this is. So on the one hand, we are in the midst of a pandemic, so we want to go as quickly as possible. On the other hand, because people are viewing this as a gold standard, using the review approaches and requirements that apply under normal circumstances for that long-term follow-up, all those checks on manufacturing and auditing the data and so forth, FDA needed to be really careful not to do anything that after the fact could be viewed as cutting corners and undermining the confidence that was intended with the full approval process. So the upshot of that was you had a lot of people on the agency staff working day and night intensely over the past few months to shorten the time to get to a full approval under priority review from something like 8 months down to 3. And that's very, very fast by FDA standards, but done with the intent of not cutting any corners, not reducing any of the review processes, the audit processes, et cetera. And I think that's about as fast as it can possibly go. I do want to emphasize that, a lot of people are viewing this as replacing an experimental approval, and that's not really what we had before. We had was a emergency authorization, which still required to get that these very big randomized clinical trials, follow-up data on lots and lots of patients, continuous updating of that data while we're seeing about new experience and very rare side effects during the course of the pandemic. So there weren't really any surprises today in terms of the evidence on safety and effectiveness. FDA had been putting that all together all along the way. So we're not really moving from an experimental phase to an approval phase so much as we're consolidating all of that information into a complete review, which hopefully will help build even more confidence in these very effective vaccines.
To your point, so millions of Americans have already been vaccinated. What have we learned about the vaccines during this period of emergency use authorization?
Well, we've learned very importantly that the basic findings from the beginning about the effectiveness of the vaccines and the safety of the vaccines has held up. So particularly for the Pfizer vaccine with the full approval, the estimated effectiveness was 91% in preventing infection and very high effectiveness in preventing hospitalization. That's slightly lower than the numbers that went into the emergency use authorization back in December. I think you can attribute that to a bit longer follow-up, and also the fact that we're dealing with some more challenging variants now, variants that are much more transmissible and easier to cause infection. So it's really good news that that effectiveness data is holding up as well as it did. On the safety side, the trials of tens of thousands of people found no evidence of serious long-term side effects, and no side effects that showed up really after the first few, the first hours to days to a few weeks after the vaccines. We have learned more about the rare occurrence of what's called pericarditis or myositis, a cardiac muscle inflammation, especially in younger males, but at a very, very low rate, an order of magnitude lower than the risk of contracting COVID infections and the risk of serious long-term consequences, including for the heart, from people who have COVID infections, even young people. So it didn't really change the picture at all in terms of very high benefits rate, very effective vaccine, very rare side effects, but it's more complete now. We've got more data on a lot more people. We've been able to see that in well over 100,000 pregnant women, the vaccine is protective, doesn't cause any adverse effects there. Really a more comprehensive picture to fill out what we saw early on in the emergency use evidence.
That's good to hear. We have several questions about vaccine mandates. So what type of impact do you believe this approval will have on vaccine mandates around the country? We saw today that the military will now require vaccinations. How about companies, local governments?
Yeah, I expect we'll see more. Now, it's important to know that under US law, for emergency use of a vaccine, companies, universities, other institutions already had quite broad authority, if there was good reason from the standpoint of the safety of their workplace, to require vaccination. In that, there has to be an out for people who have medical reasons not to be vaccinated and for people who have religious reasons not to be vaccinated. But that's going to carry over now to the full approval situation. So companies could do it before. I think they're going to be more confident now and think they'll get more acceptance from their workers to the extent that was a concern about the level of evidence on safety and effectiveness that we had. So again, we didn't really learn anything new today about that, but it is a very much more complete process with the report that's now out there in the public domain. So while we already had a number of businesses, schools, entertainment venues requiring vaccination or proof of a negative test or something like that, those numbers are going to go up significantly. That probably is going to drive the bigger impact of the full approval on vaccination rates of this country, probably even more than the remaining people who are having doubts and potentially willing to be convinced. I think you're going to see it more in workplaces. That's going to encourage people to really think about the safety and effectiveness data and maybe get around to getting the vaccine. And I think that's going to be helpful for creating safe workplaces, schools, entertainment venues, everything else we need to move beyond this pandemic.
Thank you. We have a question from Caroline Hicks. When can we expect Pfizer to get full approval for kids 12 through 15?
It's a good question. So that data was still being collected. Remember that study was a few months behind the study for approval in 16 and older. I am sure that the FDA is going to review that data quickly as Pfizer submits it. They already have submitted a good deal of it. But because it came in later and because full approval requires, as we've talked about, that longer term follow-up, there's only so much you can do to move that process along. So I'd expect a bit later this fall for that. People are also asking about, does this have any implications for kids under 12 who are not authorized yet, even for emergency use? And those studies are still ongoing. So there are larger studies underway now. They're trying to get it right in terms of dosing. The doses are going to be lower, but you want to find one that induces a strong immune response and has, but not too strong, so not too many avoidable side effects. I don't know of any serious side effects showing up in those studies yet, but they just haven't been completed. So that's probably also going to be a late this year phenomenon when we get the emergency approval for kids under in the 5 to 12 age range.
Great. We also have a question from Andrea Blanford. She wants to know what effect you think the full approval for the Pfizer vaccine will have on air travel in the US. And she mentions that right now people traveling internationally must show a negative COVID test before flying back into the country. Do you think this approval will affect that policy?
I don't think it's going to affect it in the short run. The challenge we have now is that our COVID rates around the country are so high, and COVID rates in many other countries also high, and in some cases rising. We know that people can have breakthrough cases with vaccines. We also know for the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna, and J&J, that those cases are likely to be much less serious, so still very strong protection against hospitalization. But for purposes of air travel safety, quarantining, and things like that, you really want to make sure that people have negative tests, that they're not in a position where they could transmit the virus, even if they're not having that many symptoms. So I expect those testing requirements are going to stick around until we see the COVID rates come down. And right now, we're still at very high rates in the United States. In many parts of the country, the ones that have been hardest hit this summer, especially in the South, in some of the Midwest, Missouri, Arkansas, and so forth, those rates do appear to be coming down. We're either at peak or heading or getting very close to it. But we've still got weeks ahead of very high rates of COVID in the community, high rates of transmission, risks of transmission as schools reopen, as we have college football games, et cetera. So I think we're not going to see a big reduction in the caseloads very quickly. It's just another reminder how important it is to get vaccinated.
We have another policy question from Beth Wang. Do you think full approval and increased vaccine mandates could eventually lead to the federal government requiring vaccine passports or getting involved in vaccine passport efforts?
It's a good question. The Biden administration has been pretty clear all along that they do not, and kind of underlined, do not see a federal role in requiring or administering a vaccine passport system. That said, we've seen a number of state and local governments impose something like vaccine requirements for indoor dining, for major sports events, for indoor big entertainment events. And I expect to see more of that happening. Also expect to see more of it happening through the private sector. So Live Nation, for example, a group that has collaborated with us on an effort that Duke-Margolis is involved with, a COVID collaborative, COVID safe zones initiative. Just Google that, it's a mouthful, COVID collaborative and COVID safe zones. Come companies like Live Nation are participating in this effort. They include steps like requiring proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test to attend a live indoor concert event. Those are steps that will promote more safety and with hopefully not too much disruption for people. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be a federally mandated system. This would be a system implemented by local governments, businesses, schools, et cetera, to have appropriate safety for their particular circumstances.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I'll try to get to them in the time we have allocated. We have a question from Corey Stieg. What could full FDA approval mean for companies' return to office plans?
I think the most important thing for a company's return to office is to have safe conditions in the office, and vaccination definitely helps with that. So this will, as we've just been talking about, perhaps lead more businesses, or I should say it will lead more businesses to have a requirement for vaccination in their workforce. That's probably the single most important step to reducing risk of transmission and keeping people safe in the workforce and when they go home to their families and back into the communities afterwards. There are other steps that employers can take to help their employees get back to work safely. Ventilation is really important, some distancing, masks, at least while the COVID rates in the community are high. We have seen that when you implement this combination of steps and maybe having some regular testing of employees along with that, or students in the case of schools, you can detect outbreaks before they spread. You can create a quite safe workplace. So I think employers will be looking at this approval as maybe a reason to push a bit more on the vaccination expectations or requirement in the workplace along with those other steps. So I think businesses can get back to work, but as long as we have high COVID rates, they need to be thinking about this combination of steps.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, we have a question from Daniel Pierce. Which industries outside of the healthcare system, and I suppose the military from what we've seen today, do you see leading the way for vaccine mandates in the wake of FDA approval?
That's a great question. We're seeing it really all over the economy. So just one more time, I guess I'll plug the COVID collaborative COVID safe zones. It's a collaborative effort among a range of public health experts, former government leaders in public health from Republican, Democratic administrations, the last 5 administrations, and collaboration with many businesses around the country. And among the ones that are participating are airlines. It's a close proximity and important for the staff to be protected, important to contain outbreaks through other steps too, like good ventilation. So United Airlines has been part of this. Manufacturing and food processing companies where people have to work in close proximity. So Tyson's Foods has imposed or is taking some of these similar steps around vaccination and ventilation, masking where needed, other steps to keep workplaces safe. I mentioned Live Nation before, that's in the entertainment field. And there also are over 600 colleges and universities that have imposed either a strong encouragement or I think increasingly requirements for vaccination for students, but also for faculty and staff. And all of those are businesses or schools or universities where people come into close proximity just by the nature of the enterprise. And if we want to have all of those activities take place safely this fall, it's really important to take the steps that we know work, including vaccination, to enable them to occur safely.
Thank you. Another question about the FDA process and timeline. So will the Pfizer vaccine need to be modified as new forms of the virus appear? And if that happens, will the FDA approval process need to restart, or what will happen in that situation?
Well, there are no plans for the short-term discussion around potential boosters in for the U.S. population, especially those in higher risk groups who got vaccinated early on. There are no plans for a modified vaccination for that in the short term. In fact, right now, Pfizer and Moderna and J&J are completing studies and submitting the data from those studies of what happens when people get a booster dose. That's going to be really important for the upcoming decisions by the FDA and the CDC. Now, I know the administration got out a little bit in front of this past week, and that's because they want to make sure that we're ready as soon as possible in case that evidence shows, as some of it seems to suggest, that boosters may be needed for higher risk individuals, at least, and those who got vaccinated early, as soon as, say, a month from now. But those studies are going to come in, and that's what it is mainly about, an additional dose of the vaccines that you already got. So that's where the focus is for the fall. I would expect that when those studies are completed, they will get added to the label for the FDA full approval of Pfizer, and then when it comes, Moderna and J&J later this year. There also is work underway about what happens when you cross vaccines, so switch from, one vaccine to the other, so from a J&J to mRNA or mRNA to J&J, and what the impacts of those combinations would be. There's some reasons to think it may actually be beneficial for people, but those are still some time off. And there also are modified mRNA vaccines that are more reflective of Delta, not the ones we have now were designed, a couple of variants ago. Those are in testing as well, but probably wouldn't get into use until early next year. And when FDA already has a very, very strong base for an approved product, these product modifications sometimes can occur. It depends really on the circumstances and what the data shows. Sometimes can occur without quite the same degree of additional evidence collection, because you already got such a strong base of evidence with the full approval. But those are going to be more issues around the modified vaccines, I think, as we head into 2022, not for the issues with decisions about boosters over the next few months.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more. We have another good question from Daniel Pierce. He wants to know if parents should or shouldn't read too much into the FDA not yet approving or giving full approval for children 12 to 15 years old.
Yeah, absolutely should not. This is just, again, it's a matter of the requirements for full approval in terms of long-term data for a large number of individuals and the time to audit and review all that data at the person by person level. It just takes time for that data to come in. It takes a little bit of time, even with FDA working day and night, to review it. If there were any concerns about the use of vaccine emerging in people 12 to 15, you would be hearing about it. It's something that FDA is staying on top of. And just like we saw with the other rare side effects that have turned up infrequently with the vaccines, they start being used in millions of people. There will be a close review of that, not only by FDA, but by CDC as all that data comes together. So the fact that we're not seeing anything like that turning up is a good indication that so far, at least, as all that additional longer term data is accumulating and being reviewed, FDA is not seeing anything in the way of new concerns about the 12 to 15 population.
Thank you. Dr. McClellan, do you have time for one more question?
Okay.
What would you say to someone who is still skeptical about receiving the Pfizer vaccine, even after this full approval?
Yeah, and there are people like that. There are people who have just said, no, they're not going to do it. I think the most effective approaches I've seen are ones where you start out not by telling them, look, here's the full approval, but by asking the questions, what is it that their concerns are? And once you go through those particular concerns, whether it's about, or these vaccines seem to have come along too quickly. Well, actually, if you go back and look, the technology has been developed over a decade or more in all of them, and we have a lot of experience from all of that time about the vaccines and what they do and don't do, or if it's about certain kinds of side effects that people have heard about on the internet, and there really is a lot of misinformation out there, unfortunately. Looking closely at what the evidence is on that's an area where the full approval should be helpful, because it's like a very comprehensive compilation of everything that's been seen in association with these vaccines, and a very comprehensive review of what adverse events could be attributed to the vaccines, or it may be some other issues, like thinking that they're not at high risk because they're younger. Well, what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is lots of hospitalizations and some significant cases of long COVID, post-acute symptoms that are fairly serious in young athletes, in kids, that are happening at a much higher rate. If you just go out and look at the data now, happening at a much higher rate than any of the rare side effects that people have been worried about could theoretically be associated with a vaccine. So I think talking through all those things with individuals, many of them are going to have to confront this a little bit more clearly, because they're likely to face requirements for vaccine at work, or in going out to dinner, or in going to events at clubs or entertainment venues. So I hope people can know where to go for good answers on all of that. And the full approval definitely puts a lot more evidence out there.
Excellent. Thank you to Dr. Mark McClellan, for sharing your time and perspective. I'd like to say that Duke hosts weekly media briefings. So if you'd like to attend future briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please stay well, and thank you.